Our next unit of the semester is interpreting literature using literary criticism. So what does that mean? What does it mean to use literary criticism to interpret literature? Well, you can think of it kind of like a lens. So you would place a lens over a piece of literature and then interpret that piece of literature using that lens. So we have a poem here by Emily Dickinson. I'm wife, I finished that. That other state. I'm czar, I'm woman now. It's safer so. How odd the girl's life looks behind the soft eclipse. I think that earth feels so to folks in heaven. Now, this being comfort, then that other kind was pain. But why compare? I'm wife, stop there. So there's our poem. So that's our piece of literature. And what we would do is take various literary theories or literary lenses to interpret that poem. So one common way is using the formalist approach, which is more or less what we've been doing all semester. So we would look at this poem through these literary elements, like looking at the word choice, looking if there's any irony or paradox or metaphor, and we would interpret the text using the elements of this particular lens, which is formalist criticism. Another way that we could interpret this poem is through biographical criticism, and that would be looking at the literature through the lens of the author's life. So if we were going to ask questions about this particular poem, we might say, how does the fact that Dickinson herself never married influence the poem? And is the fact that she may have wanted to marry or that her brother's marriage was a disappointment to her affect how the speaker sees marriage? So that would be another approach to using literary criticism to interpret the text. For our class for this semester, for the essay, I don't want you guys to use formalist criticism because it's more or less what we were doing in the first essay. And I don't want you to use biographical criticism because it sort of reduces the literature to just kind of more of an autobiographical approach. So rather than looking at the literature as an art, we just see it as an extension of the writer's life. It's the remaining approaches here that I want you to be using for our next unit here in interpreting literature using literary criticism. So the first type is historical criticism. And so when we use that lens, we are looking at how the text displays its time and place that it was originally written. So if we were looking at the Dickinson poem, we would say, well, what was the role of women in the 19th century? And especially what were the societal assumptions about marriage and about spinsterhood? And does that poem seem to criticize those assumptions and what was going on at the time? Or does it challenge those assumptions? So that is the historical approach. A related approach is what we call new historical criticism. And that approach looks more specifically at other texts that were written at the same time. So it might be looking at diaries, or it might be looking at what other writers have been saying along with the original text. And what these critics are concerned with is power. They're looking for the power dynamics that are at play within these different alternative texts that were written contemporaneously, so written at the same time. So other historical documents, diaries, other texts. So they are looking for what other groups or institutions or assumptions that were at play that somehow dominated the viewpoint of that time. And what they're really trying to do is look for any kind of marginalized viewpoints or groups. So if we were going to apply new criticism to the Dickinson poem, we might take a look at what other diary entries of women in the 1860s, what were they writing about, and how through reading those diaries does it reveal attitudes about middle-class marriage. We might think about other historical or cultural texts from the same time period, and are there any similarities, or do we see differences, and what can we kind of discern from either these similarities or differences? So that's new historical. So it's much like historical, where we're looking at the historical context of the piece that was written, but the difference is we elevate competing texts. So we elevate other maybe non-literary texts, so historical documents and diaries, and or other literary texts. And again, we're concerned about power. So who has the power, and how are those power those groups that are powerful kind of revealing the viewpoints that were marginalized at the time. Okay. Our next lens is psychological research. And so I think a lot of people are used to doing psychological research in which we kind of psychoanalyze the characters. So prior to 1950, a lot of psychological criticism was actually psychoanalyzing the author of the text. But that's kind of, it's kind of an approach that's not used in our day and age. We stay away from psychoanalyzing the authors, but rather we're psychoanalyzing the characters. So in this, if we're looking at the Dickinson poem, we might say, okay, how does the speaker subvert the role of the subjugated wife, right? And how does she try to elevate herself to the powerful emperor? What feelings, either conscious or unconscious, might motivate the speaker to fantasize about that she's somebody else? So we're looking at psychoanalyzing the characters, or in this case, the speaker in a poem. Mythological criticism, then, we would interpret the text looking for these archetypes or symbols that are at play in the text. So we look for any type of reoccurring pattern in literature, or any type of kind of universal meaning that's kind of held in a symbol. So if we're going to look at the Dickinson poem, we might say, okay, what does heaven and earth represent? How are those references at play? What would we really think about the role of wife and czar, and how could those kind of show us some sort of connection to powerful female characters from myths and legends, or human or the divine? Do we see any biblical references? So we're really looking for symbols and archetypes, those kind of reoccurring patterns throughout literature when we're using mythological criticism. Marxism is taking a look at the text by thinking about much like historical, lots of power relations, but we're looking at the hierarchies of power. So with Marxism, we're always looking for what we call the capitalist class, or those people who have power, and then the proletariat class, those people that are somehow subjugated to the people who have power. And that power might come in many forms. It's not just economic power. A lot of times people think of Marxism as just economic power, but it's political power, social power, religious power. And it's trying to reveal who had the power and what voices were marginalized in the time that it was written. So we might focus on a couple of key areas in the language. It's safer so, stop there. And so this idea of who's holding power over whom, and how is that power exerted and maintained. So that's what we would do in Marxist criticism. We've got a few more to look at here. So we've got feminist criticism. So again, another lens, another way of viewing literature, and again through power dynamics. But this time we're looking at it through the dynamic of gender, so women's power and men's power. And so we would look at what the work reveals about the position and influence of women during the time frame that it was written. And sometimes the critics just want to reflect what the female experience was at that time. And sometimes these critics are actually agitating for some sort of social change. So you could do kind of either approach as a feminist critic. If we were going to look at the Dickinson poem, we might think about what would the role of woman and wife be that are suggested in the poem? And are there any power struggles, especially with that word czar? Do we see some sort of power dynamics at play with that word choice? And is there any gendered power? Do we see any power of a certain gender holding power over another gender? So that would be the feminist read. Gender criticism looks at how we actually define these terms, masculine and feminism. So we would look for what is assumed to be the role of women versus the role of men, and what are the implications of that word czar. It becomes really important with this one as well. And then this idea of predetermined gender roles. We'd be kind of concerned about what the poem suggests about that. Structuralist criticism is a little bit difficult for some people. And what you're doing with structuralist criticism is you're looking for how the piece is structured. So the arrangement of plot, how things were divided into different sections or chapters or stanzas, any repetition, any patterns that you see. And we're especially looking for what's called binary opposition, so that in order to have one thing be in existence, the only way it has reality is by defining its opposite. So if I were to say happy, of course, to understand happiness, we have to understand sadness and vice versa. So those are what we call binary, or ideas that are held in binary opposition. So in the Dickinson poem then, we would be looking for any type of binary position. So I'm wife versus with the capital W. So is there some sort of difference? Is there some sort of opposite notion at play there? Is it reflecting some sort of cultural values? The division of the poem into those three stanzas, and how do each one of those stanzas reveal something about the culture or the cultural values? Structural criticism, its goal is just to comment on what the culture values. So in a particular culture, if we use structuralism, we can see what that culture deems important. Sometimes I like to talk about fairy tales with structural criticism. I think it makes a lot of sense. So in your textbook, in the Diani textbook, under the structural criticism, there's a brief discussion of the story of Cinderella. And of course, the way the story plays out, we've got poor Cinderella, right? And then the stepsisters are rich. So we notice that the way that story's played out, that what is valued in that culture is being rich. And of course, beautiful versus ugly. What's valued by the way that we see the narration play out is the beauty is valued over ugly. And so we use binary opposition to get at what the culture values. I'm going to run out of time here, so I'm going to leave these last two for you to read through. I think you guys are probably getting a good sense of how we're applying literary theories to a particular poem, and by using that application, we're going to interpret something different. So if we're reading this poem through a feminist lens, we're going to understand something very different than if we read it through, say, a structuralist lens. So the lens that you choose actually determines kind of the type of reading that you will have, or the type of interpretation that you'll have of the poem. Okay, let me know if you have questions, and that's it. Bye for now.